The rain had been falling against the windows of Thornbridge Hall's library for 3 hours when Grace Pemberton looked up from the correspondence she was organising to find Lord Marcus Ashford standing at the far window with his back to the room, one hand braced against the frame and his shoulders carrying that particular quality of tension she had learned to recognise over 8 years, 4 months, and 11 days of silent observation, of loving him from a distance so carefully maintained that he had never once suspected the depth of feeling she harboured for a man who barely registered her existence beyond the vague awareness that his aunt's companion performed her duties with adequate efficiency and did not intrude upon his notice with unwelcome conversation or presumptuous familiarity. She watched the line of his spine, the way the lamplight caught in his dark hair where it curled slightly against his collar, despite his valet's best efforts to tame it into fashionable submission, the unconscious grace with which he held himself even in moments of private contemplation when no one was watching and social performance was unnecessary, and she felt the familiar ache in her chest that had become as constant and unremarkable as breathing, the exquisite torture of proximity without possession, of knowing every detail of his habits and preferences and moods, while remaining utterly unknown to him, invisible in the way that servants and companions were always invisible to the aristocrats they served, present but not present, seen but not truly observed. 8 years, 4 months, and 11 days since she had arrived at Thornbridge Hall as Lady Beatrice's companion, a position secured through the desperate machinations of her deceased father's solicitor, who had understood that a gentlewoman fallen on hard times had limited options beyond marriage or employment in some capacity that allowed her to maintain the fiction of respectability while accepting the reality of dependence. She had been 21 years old and newly orphaned, her father's death having revealed debts that consumed the modest estate she had expected to inherit, and left her with nothing but her education, her gentle birth, and the increasingly desperate awareness that women of her class who lacked fortune or beauty had few paths available beyond the charity of relatives who might or might not be inclined to house an impoverished connection. Lady Beatrice had offered employment rather than charity, a position as companion that came with a small salary, and the preservation of dignity that accepting money for services rendered provided, and Grace had accepted with profound gratitude and the determination to perform her duties so well that Lady Beatrice would never regret her kindness or question the decision to hire someone with no previous experience in such work. She had fallen in love with Marcus Ashford approximately 17 minutes after arriving at Thornbridge Hall, though she had not recognised the sensation immediately, had mistaken the peculiar breathlessness she experienced when he entered the drawing room for her interview with Lady Beatrice for simple nervousness about securing the position, had attributed the way her pulse accelerated when he glanced in her direction to anxiety about making a proper impression on the nephew who was master of the estate where she hoped to live and work. He had been 32 years old then, already possessed of the remote courtesy and carefully controlled emotions that characterized all his interactions, acknowledging her presence with a brief bow and a murmured greeting that suggested he had already forgotten her name before completing the introduction, his attention returning immediately to the book he had been reading when Lady Beatrice summoned him to meet her new companion. But Grace had seen something in that brief moment of eye contact, some quality of banked emotion, or carefully suppressed feeling that suggested the coldness was constructed rather than innate, a wall built deliberately to keep the world at a safe distance rather than natural inclination toward isolation, and she had found herself wanting to understand what had caused such defensive architecture, what wounds required such careful protection. The understanding had come gradually over the first year of her employment, assembled from fragments of conversation overheard and observations made during the social gatherings Lady Beatrice insisted on hosting despite her nephew's obvious preference for solitude, from comments the housekeeper made about how different Lord Marcus had been before that terrible business with Miss Wentworth, from the portrait that hung in the long gallery showing a younger Marcus with an openness in his expression that had been entirely absent from the man. Miss Clarissa Wentworth had been his betrothed, a union arranged between families and apparently supported by genuine affection on Marcus's, though whether Clarissa had shared that affection or simply accepted the match for its material advantages remained unclear from the stories Grace pieced together. What was clear was that Clarissa had broken the engagement 3 weeks before the wedding, choosing instead to marry Lord Pemberton, a man 30 years her senior, but possessed of a fortune that made Marcus's comfortable wealth seem modest by comparison, and that Marcus had received the news with such devastating composure that his family had been more frightened by his control than they would have been by visible grief or anger. He closed like a door slamming shut, the housekeeper had told Grace during one of their rare moments of confidence, her voice carrying the particular sorrow of someone who had known Marcus since childhood and mourned the transformation from warm boy to cold man. One day he was planning his wedding and talking about the nursery that would need refurbishing for the children he hoped to have. And the next, he was this. She had gestured vaguely toward the closed study door where Marcus spent most of his time. This stranger who performs all his duties perfectly but feels nothing, says nothing that matters, allows no one close enough to see whether there's anything left inside him worth knowing. Grace had understood then that Marcus's distance was not personal rejection, but universal withdrawal, that he treated her with the same remote courtesy he employed toward everyone, that her invisibility was shared by every person who attempted to bridge the gap between his politeness and his genuine self. The knowledge had brought both relief, that she had not somehow failed to interest him through deficiency of character or appearance, and despair, because if he noticed no one, then her particular qualities, such as they were, could never distinguish her sufficiently to penetrate his defenses and create the kind of recognition that might lead to something more than employers' vague awareness of employees' adequate performance. But she had loved him anyway, helplessly and completely, finding in his rare moments of unguarded expression the slight softening when Lady Beatrice made him laugh despite his determination to remain unmoved, the flash of genuine concern when a tenant brought news of illness or hardship, the way his hands moved over his books with unconscious tenderness, evidence of the man he might have been if Clarissa Wentworth had not taught him that vulnerability led only to devastating betrayal. Grace had learned his routines and preferences with the dedication of a devoted scholar, understanding without being told that he took his coffee black with 1 sugar in the morning but preferred tea in the afternoon, that he read philosophy when troubled and poetry when peaceful, that he walked the east lawn at dawn regardless of weather and visited the stables every evening to check on the horses personally, rather than trusting entirely to his groom's reports. She had made herself useful in small ways he never noticed, ensuring his favourite newspapers were laid out precisely as he preferred them, that the library fire was always burning at the temperature he found comfortable, that his correspondence was sorted by priority, so he need not waste time determining what required immediate attention. And she had done all of this not from duty, but from love, from the desperate need to care for him in whatever limited ways her position permitted, even if he never knew the source of these small comforts, or understood that someone had arranged them specifically for his benefit. The moment that had sustained her through 8 years, 4 months, and 11 days of this invisible devotion had lasted perhaps 3 seconds, occurring in this very library during a rainstorm not unlike tonight's, when she had been reaching for a volume of Lord Byron's poetry at precisely the same moment. Marcus extended his hand toward the same book. Their fingers had touched, his bare skin against her gloved hand, and the contact had sent such a shock through her system that she had gasped audibly, her eyes flying to his face to find him looking at her with an expression she could not read, but which might have been surprise or possibly recognition, some acknowledgement that she existed as a person, rather than simply as part of the household furniture. The moment had stretched, neither of them moving, the book suspended between their reaching hands and the air thick with possibility, and Grace had felt her heart hammering so violently she thought surely he must hear it, must understand from the visible flush rising in her cheeks that this accidental contact affected her far beyond its surface insignificance. Then Marcus had withdrawn his hand and stepped back, murmuring some conventional apology about not having seen her reaching for the volume, his expression smoothing back into its customary polite blankness, and Grace had managed to stammer something equally conventional in response, while her entire body trembled with the aftershock of his touch and the devastating recognition that what had been for her a moment of profound connection had been for him merely an awkward accident requiring brief acknowledgement before being dismissed from memory. She had held that volume of Byron for the remainder of the afternoon, unable to read a single word through the tears that blurred her vision, understanding with crushing certainty that she could not continue indefinitely in this state of loving without hope of return, that the exquisite torture of proximity was slowly eroding her ability to maintain the composure her position required, that eventually she would betray herself through some unguarded word or expression and destroy the careful invisibility that protected both her employment and her dignity. The decision to leave had formed slowly over the months that followed that brief touch, crystallizing into certainty through accumulated small moments that confirmed Marcus's utter unconsciousness of her as anything beyond a useful presence in his household, someone who managed Lady Beatrice's correspondence and social calendar and kept his aunt comfortable and entertained, and therefore freed him from obligations he preferred to avoid. She had watched him interact with the young women Lady Beatrice invited to dinner parties and country house weekends, women of appropriate rank and fortune who made no secret of their interest in securing his attention and possibly his hand, and she had seen him treat each of them with the same mechanical courtesy, the same careful distance, the same absolute refusal to engage beyond the surface requirements of social performance. His rejection was universal and therefore not personal, but that knowledge provided no comfort, offered no relief from the growing awareness that she was destroying herself through proximity to something she could never possess, that she needed to leave before love transformed entirely into the kind of desperate longing that would make her bitter and strange, one of those pathetic companions who lived vicariously through their employers because they had no life of their own worth living. She had written the resignation letter 6 weeks ago, sitting at the small desk in her chamber while rain drummed against the windows and the house slept around her, and the act of putting words to paper had felt like dying and being born simultaneously, like cutting away a diseased limb to save the body from spreading corruption. The letter had been brief and professional, thanking Lady Beatrice for 8 years of employment and explaining that Grace felt it was time to seek a new position, perhaps abroad, where her skills might be useful to an English family living in warmer climates, some place where the physical distance would match the emotional distance she needed to establish between herself and Marcus Ashford. She had signed her name with a hand that shook despite her determination to approach this practically rather than emotionally, and she had sealed the letter and placed it in the drawer of her desk where it had remained for 6 weeks while she gathered her courage to actually deliver it, to set in motion the series of events that would culminate in her departure from Thornbridge Hall and the final severing of the connection, invisible and one-sided as it was, that had defined her adult life. Tonight she had finally decided she would give Lady Beatrice the letter tomorrow morning, that she could not continue delaying the inevitable simply because leaving Marcus would feel like tearing out her own heart, that she owed herself the opportunity to build a life elsewhere, to perhaps find some measure of peace, if not happiness, to stop existing as a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's story, and become the protagonist of her own narrative, however modest and unremarkable that narrative might prove to be. The decision brought a strange calm, a sense of resolution that felt almost like peace, even though underneath the surface ran currents of grief and loss, and the terrible awareness that she was choosing to leave the only man she would ever love, that no future position or distant country would erase him from her thoughts or her heart, that she would carry this love with her like a scar, permanent evidence of damage endured and survived. Marcus turned from the window suddenly, his gaze sweeping the library as if seeking something, and for a moment his eyes landed on Grace with unusual focus, his expression shifting into something that might have been confusion or possibly surprise, as if he were seeing her for the first time, despite her 8 years, 4 months, and 11 days of constant presence in his household. "Miss Pemberton," he said, and his voice carried a quality Grace had never heard before, something uncertain or perhaps questioning, as if he were not quite sure of her name or her purpose, despite the years of her service. "I did not realize you were still here. The hour is quite late. You need not feel obligated to continue working after the household has retired." Grace stood carefully, smoothing her skirts with hands that wanted to tremble, and managed a composed smile that revealed nothing of the chaos his simple acknowledgement had created in her chest. "I was merely finishing the correspondence sorting, my lord," she said, proud that her voice emerged steady and professional despite the way her pulse had accelerated at his direct address, at being noticed for once, rather than existing in her customary state of functional invisibility. "Lady Beatrice has several invitations requiring responses, and I thought it best to organize them so we might review her social calendar together tomorrow morning." "You are very efficient," Marcus observed, and Grace could not determine whether the comment was compliment or simply neutral acknowledgement of competence, could not read anything in his expression beyond polite interest. "My aunt frequently remarks on how fortunate she is to have secured your services, how much more smoothly her life runs with your assistance in managing all the details that she finds tedious or overwhelming." "Lady Beatrice is very kind," Grace replied, the conventional response emerging automatically, while her mind raced with confusion about this unusual conversation, this extended acknowledgement of her presence and her work, wondering what had prompted Marcus to suddenly notice her existence beyond vague awareness that she performed some necessary function in his household. "I am grateful for the opportunity to serve her, and I hope my work has been satisfactory throughout my employment here." Something flickered in Marcus's expression, gone too quickly for Grace to identify, but leaving behind the impression of disturbance or possibly distress. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested the words cost him more than their surface simplicity would indicate. "More than satisfactory," he said quietly. "You have been," he paused, seeming to search for the precise word, "essential to this household's functioning, Miss Pemberton, though I suspect we have all been remiss in expressing our appreciation for the countless ways you maintain order and comfort for everyone here." Grace felt something crack inside her chest at those words, at hearing herself described as essential by a man who had never before indicated he noticed her contributions at all, and she had to swallow hard against the tears that threatened to emerge and betray the depth of her emotional response to what was probably merely conventional courtesy, expressed with unusual directness. "You are very generous, my lord," she managed, her voice slightly unsteady despite her efforts at control. "But I assure you, no special appreciation is required. I have simply performed the duties for which I was employed, nothing more than any competent companion would provide." "I think we both know that is not true," Marcus said, and this time there was no mistaking the emotion in his voice, something rough and sincere that suggested genuine feeling beneath his customary reserve. "You have given far more than duty requires, Miss Pemberton, though I suspect I am only now beginning to understand how much I, have taken for granted your presence and your care." Before Grace could formulate any response to this extraordinary statement, before she could determine what Marcus meant, or why tonight of all nights he had chosen to acknowledge her existence beyond the purely functional, the door opened to admit Mrs. Fletcher, the housekeeper, her face pale and her expression troubled. "Pardon the intrusion, my lord," she said, her voice urgent, "but Lady Beatrice has taken ill quite suddenly. Dr. Morrison is being sent for, but in the meantime Miss Pemberton is needed urgently. Her ladyship is asking for her specifically." Grace was moving before Mrs. Fletcher finished speaking, all thoughts of Marcus and his strange conversation driven from her mind by immediate concern for Lady Beatrice, for the woman who had taken her in when she had nowhere to go, and who had become far more than simply an employer, over 8 years of daily proximity and shared routines. She was aware of Marcus following her up the stairs toward Lady Beatrice's chambers, could feel his presence behind her like a physical weight, but she focused entirely on reaching her employer, on assessing the situation and determining what care was needed, on being useful in this crisis, rather than dwelling on the impossible complexities of her own feelings, or the conversation that had been interrupted by emergency. Lady Beatrice's illness proved serious enough to require 3 days of constant nursing before Dr. Morrison declared the crisis past and the patient stabilized, 3 days during which Grace barely left the sick room, except for brief intervals when Mrs. Fletcher or one of the maids could relieve her long enough to change her clothes or consume whatever food could be brought to her, since she refused to abandon her post for the formality of dining in the proper manner. She had learned through those 72 hours just how deeply she had come to love Lady Beatrice, not simply as employer, but as the closest thing to family she had known since her father's death, had understood through the terrible fear that accompanied every laboured breath and every spike in fever that losing this woman would cost her far more than her employment and her comfortable position at Thornbridge Hall. Marcus had appeared in the sick room at odd hours throughout those 3 days, standing in the doorway watching Grace work with an intensity that would have made her uncomfortable if she had possessed sufficient energy to notice or care, but she had been too focused on her patient to pay attention to anything beyond Lady Beatrice's immediate needs and the careful administration of medicines and treatments that Dr. Morrison had prescribed. It was only on the 4th day, when Lady Beatrice was sleeping peacefully for the first time since falling ill, and Grace had finally allowed herself to sink into the chair beside the bed for a moment's rest, that she became aware of Marcus entering the room with unusual quietness, moving to stand at the foot of the bed and study his aunt with an expression of profound relief, mixed with something else Grace could not quite identify. "She will recover," Grace said softly, not wanting to disturb Lady Beatrice's rest, but sensing that Marcus needed reassurance, needed to hear someone state definitively what Dr. Morrison had already confirmed. "The fever has broken and her breathing has eased considerably. Dr. Morrison believes she will be fully recovered within a fortnight if she rests properly and does not overtax herself." Marcus's eyes moved from his aunt to Grace, and she saw him take in her rumpled appearance, the shadows under her eyes from too little sleep, the way her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion, and the after-effects of sustained fear and vigilant attention. "You have barely left this room," he observed, his voice carrying that same quality of roughness she had heard in the library 4 nights earlier. "Mrs. Fletcher tells me you refused to be relieved for more than brief intervals, that you insisted on maintaining the night watches yourself despite my suggestion that we hire additional nurses to share the burden." "Lady Beatrice is my responsibility," Grace replied simply, too tired to maintain the careful distance she usually employed in Marcus's presence, too depleted to guard her words or expressions with the precision that had become second nature over 8 years of determined invisibility. "I could not entrust her care to strangers when I was capable of providing it myself, when I knew her preferences and her routines, and could interpret her needs even when she was too ill to communicate them clearly. She has been kind to me, my lord, kinder than I had any right to expect, and I could not abandon her when she needed me more." "I find myself profoundly grateful for your care of her," Marcus said quietly, and Grace heard in those words something beyond conventional appreciation, some depth of genuine emotion that suggested he understood precisely what her vigil had cost and what it revealed about the nature of her attachment to his aunt. "And I find myself wondering—" He paused, his jaw tightening as if the next words required physical effort to produce. "What we would do if you were not here, if you were to leave as you are apparently planning to do." "How?" Grace felt the blood drain from her face, shock and confusion making her momentarily speechless as she tried to understand how Marcus knew about her resignation when she had not yet delivered the letter to Lady Beatrice, had told no one of her intention to depart at summer's end. "I do not understand," she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you— Who told you I was planning to leave?" "Your chamber door was open yesterday when I passed in the corridor," Marcus said, his expression taut with something that might have been distress or possibly anger, though directed at whom or what Grace could not determine. "I could see your desk through the doorway, and I saw the letter with Lady Beatrice's name written on the envelope in your hand. I did not read it. I would not presume to invade your privacy so thoroughly, but the context seemed clear enough to suggest you were tendering your resignation. Am I mistaken in that interpretation?" Grace shook her head slowly, unable to summon any words that might explain or justify her decision, unable to articulate the complex reasons that had led to her choice to leave without revealing far more than was safe about her feelings and her years of silent suffering. "I was planning to give Lady Beatrice the letter tomorrow," she admitted, her voice shaking despite her efforts to maintain composure. "I have been most grateful for my position here, most appreciative of the security and comfort I have enjoyed these past 8 years, but I feel it is time for me to seek new opportunities elsewhere, perhaps in a household that might benefit from my experience and my skills." "That is not a reason," Marcus said sharply, moving around the bed to stand closer to where Grace sat, close enough that she could see the fine lines of tension around his eyes and mouth, the barely controlled emotion that seemed to vibrate just beneath his carefully maintained surface. "That is an excuse, a professional explanation that reveals nothing of your actual motivations for leaving a position you claim to value, and an employer you have just demonstrated you care for deeply enough to sacrifice sleep and health to preserve. What is the real reason, Miss Pemberton? What has driven you to this decision after 8 years of apparently satisfactory service?" Grace rose from her chair, unable to remain seated, while Marcus loomed over her demanding answers she could not give without destroying what remained of her dignity and her carefully preserved composure. "I cannot explain my reasons to your satisfaction, my lord," she said, keeping her voice low and steady through sheer force of will. I can only assure you that they are personal rather than professional, that I have no complaints about my treatment or my circumstances here, that Lady Beatrice has been uniformly kind and generous, and I could not ask for a better employer. But sometimes one must make changes, even when current circumstances are comfortable, must seek new directions, even when remaining in familiar patterns would be easier. I hope you will not press me further on this matter. I do not wish to be discourteous, but neither can I offer you the detailed explanation you seem to require. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his pale grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made Grace's breath catch in her throat, made her heart pound with that familiar combination of hope and fear that had characterized every interaction they had shared over 8 years of invisible devotion. Then he stepped back, his expression closing down into its customary reserve. And when he spoke, his voice carried the cool politeness she knew far better than the rough emotion of moments earlier. "I apologize for my inappropriate insistence," he said formally. "Your reasons are your own business, and I had no right to demand explanations beyond what you chose to offer. I hope you will forgive my intrusion and my presumption." He left the room without waiting for her response, the door closing behind him with careful quietness that somehow felt more violent than a slam, and Grace sank back into her chair, with her hands pressed against her mouth to stifle the sob that wanted to escape, overwhelmed by the emotional chaos of the past 4 days, and the terrible recognition that Marcus's sudden attention came too late, that she had already made her decision and could not allow a few moments of unusual acknowledgement to sway her from the path she knew she needed to follow if she were to have any hope of eventually building a life worth living. The following 2 weeks were among the strangest of Grace's 8 years, 4 months, and 11 days at Thornbridge Hall, a period during which Marcus seemed to develop an unprecedented interest in appearing wherever she happened to be, inserting himself into spaces he had never previously occupied, and engaging in stilted conversations that seemed to have no purpose beyond maintaining his presence in her vicinity. She would be arranging flowers in the morning room, and he would materialize to comment on the selection of blooms, to offer his opinion on whether roses or peonies made a more suitable centerpiece, despite having never previously shown the slightest interest in household decorations. She would be reading in the library during her afternoon respite, and he would arrive with a book he claimed to need, but which he never actually opened, instead settling into a nearby chair and watching her with an expression she could not decipher, while making occasional remarks about the weather, or the condition of the roads, or other topics of supreme irrelevance and obvious disinterest. Most disturbing were his appearances in the rose garden, where Grace had formed the habit of walking each before dinner, a private space she had claimed as her own during her early months at Thornbridge, when she had needed somewhere to retreat from the overwhelming grief and displacement of her new life. Marcus had never once walked in that garden in all the years of her residence, had seemed to actively avoid the space that his mother had created decades earlier before her death, when Marcus was still a child. But now he appeared there each evening without fail, wandering the paths as if by accident, and then expressing surprise at finding Grace there despite the obviousness of his intentional presence. At first, Grace had thought perhaps Lady Beatrice's illness had shaken him more than he revealed, that his unusual behaviour represented some reaction to nearly losing his aunt, and to recognizing through that crisis how much he had taken for granted her presence and the stability she provided in his otherwise isolated existence. But as the days passed and his proximity campaign continued unabated, as she caught him watching her with expressions that cycled through confusion and distress, and something that might have been longing if she had not known better than to interpret his attention as anything beyond belated recognition of her usefulness to his household, she began to understand that something had shifted in Marcus, some change had occurred that made him suddenly conscious of her existence in ways he had never been before, though what had prompted that change and what it meant remained entirely opaque to her, despite her years of careful observation and her intimate knowledge of his habits and patterns. Lady Beatrice had recovered sufficiently by the 2nd week to leave her chamber and resume light activities, though Dr. Morrison insisted she must rest frequently and avoid any strenuous exertion until she had fully regained her strength. Grace had delivered her resignation letter the morning after their conversation in the sick room, watching Lady Beatrice's face fall as she read the brief explanation and the formal notice that Grace would remain through summer's end to ensure adequate time for securing and training a replacement. Lady Beatrice had attempted to convince her to reconsider, had offered increased salary and reduced duties, and anything else that might induce Grace to remain. But when Grace gently insisted that her decision was final and her mind made up, Lady Beatrice had accepted with visible sadness, tempered by affection and concern. "You have been like a daughter to me these 8 years," Lady Beatrice had said, her voice thick with emotion. "More than simply a companion or employee, Grace, but truly family, in all the ways that matter despite lacking blood connection. I had hoped you would remain at Thornbridge indefinitely, that perhaps someday—" She had stopped abruptly, seeming to reconsider whatever she had been about to say, then simply reached out to clasp Grace's hand with surprising strength for someone so recently ill. "I hope you will find happiness wherever you go," she continued quietly. "I hope you will find a situation that gives you more than what you have had here. Whatever it was that this household could not provide that has driven you to seek employment elsewhere." Grace had murmured appropriate responses and excused herself as quickly as courtesy permitted, unwilling to risk breaking down entirely in Lady Beatrice's presence, unwilling to confess that what had driven her away was not anything the household failed to provide, but rather her own inability to continue loving without her recognition that remaining at Thornbridge was slowly destroying her capacity for joy or peace or any emotion beyond the dull ache of permanent longing. She had retreated to her chamber and allowed herself to weep for perhaps half an hour before composing herself and returning to her duties, determined to fulfill her obligations with the same competence and dedication she had always employed, despite the growing awareness that every day brought her closer to leaving, and that she had perhaps 6 weeks remaining before she would walk away from Thornbridge Hall, and from Marcus Ashford, and from the only life she had known as an adult. It was Lady Beatrice who had summoned Marcus to her sitting room 3 days after Grace delivered her resignation, who had closed the door and spoken to her nephew with a directness and force that the servants later reported could be heard clearly through the walls despite both parties' obvious efforts to maintain reasonable volume. Grace had been in the adjacent morning room when the conversation occurred, ostensibly occupied with needlework, but unable to prevent herself from hearing Lady Beatrice's raised voice declaring that Marcus was a blind fool who had wasted 8 years ignoring the finest woman who would ever enter his life, that his self-imposed isolation was not noble grief, but selfish cowardice, that he was allowing fear of rejection to prevent him from pursuing the only chance at genuine happiness he was likely to encounter after Clarissa Wentworth's betrayal had taught him such devastating lessons about vulnerability and trust. "You love her," Lady Beatrice had said, her voice carrying clearly through the wall despite its muffled quality. "Do not bother denying it, Marcus. I have watched you these past 2 weeks appearing in every space she occupies, manufacturing excuses to be near her, looking at her with such longing that I am astonished she has not noticed and been thoroughly uncomfortable with your attention. You love Grace Pemberton, have probably loved her for years without recognizing the emotion for what it was, because you have been so determined to feel nothing, to remain safely isolated from any connection that might threaten your carefully constructed defenses. And now she is leaving because she cannot bear the pain of loving you without hope of return, and you are so paralyzed by your fear of rejection that you cannot speak the truth before it is too late." Marcus's response had been too quiet for Grace to hear clearly, but Lady Beatrice's next words carried unmistakable scorn and frustration. "Your capacity for self-deception is truly remarkable," she had said coldly. "You claim you are protecting her from the burden of your attention, that she deserves better than a man as emotionally damaged as you have made yourself. But the truth is that you are protecting yourself from the possibility that she might reject you as Clarissa did, that your pride might suffer another blow if you offer your heart and have it refused. Well, let me tell you something about Grace Pemberton that you have been too blind to see, despite 8 years of her devoted service to this household, and to you specifically. Though you never noticed her efforts, she loves you desperately and has loved you for years, has performed countless acts of care and attention that you attributed to general competence rather than recognizing them as expressions of affection. She is leaving because she can no longer endure the torture of proximity without possession, because loving you in silence has become unbearable. And if you allow her to leave without speaking the truth, without offering her the choice to stay as something more than my companion, then you are not simply a coward but a fool, and you will deserve the lonely existence you have created for yourself." Grace had pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle any sound that might reveal her presence and her eavesdropping, her entire body trembling with the shock of hearing Lady Beatrice articulate truths she had thought carefully hidden, of learning that her love had been obvious to Marcus's aunt, if not to Marcus himself, of understanding that Lady Beatrice had been advocating for possibilities that Grace had never dared imagine might exist outside her most secret fantasies. She had fled to her chamber before the conversation concluded, unable to remain in proximity to revelations that threatened to destroy what remained of her composure, and she had spent the evening attempting to determine what Marcus would do with the knowledge Lady Beatrice had forced upon him, whether he would ignore his aunt's blunt assessment as the ravings of a woman still weakened by illness, or whether he would act on information that changed everything Grace had believed about her position and her prospects. The answer came the following afternoon when Grace was in the portrait gallery, attempting to catalogue memories before her departure, standing before the painting of Marcus's mother that had always reminded her slightly of her own mother, though the resemblance was more in expression than actual features. She heard his footsteps on the marble floor behind her, but did not turn, could not face him after Lady Beatrice's revelations and her own humiliating awareness that her secret love was apparently no secret at all, that she had been transparent in ways she had thought carefully concealed. "My aunt tells me I have been unconsciously blind," Marcus said quietly, his voice closer than she had expected, suggesting he stood only a few feet behind her, though she had not heard him approach, beyond that first betraying sound of footsteps. "She tells me that you have loved me for years while I remained oblivious, that you are leaving because you can no longer bear the pain of caring for someone who does not return your affection. She tells me that I am a coward and a fool if I allow you to depart without speaking truths I have been too frightened to acknowledge even to myself." Grace closed her eyes against the tears that threatened to spill, her hands clenching into fists at her sides as she struggled to maintain sufficient composure to respond to this impossible conversation, to defend herself or explain herself or simply escape before she broke down entirely in front of the man who had just learned that his aunt's companion had been harboring inappropriate feelings that violated every boundary their respective positions demanded. "Lady Beatrice should not have spoken to you about such matters," she managed, her voice hoarse. "Whatever she believes she has observed regarding my feelings is purely her speculation and should not have been shared with you in such direct terms. I apologize if her comments have made you uncomfortable. I assure you I will be departing as planned and will trouble you no further with my presence once a suitable replacement has been secured." "You will trouble me considerably more by your absence than you ever have by your presence," Marcus said, and Grace heard in his voice the same roughness, the same barely controlled emotion that had characterized their conversation in Lady Beatrice's sick room 2 weeks earlier. "I have been trying for 3 days to find words adequate to what I need to say to you, Grace. May I call you Grace, given that we are apparently beyond the formalities that have constrained our interactions for 8 years? And I find that simple honesty is the only approach that might possibly convey what I have only recently understood about my own feelings and my own failures." He moved to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough that Grace could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that turning her head even slightly would bring them face to face in proximity far beyond what their respective positions had ever permitted. "I have loved you for longer than I can precisely determine," Marcus continued, his words emerging slowly, as if each one required careful consideration and deliberate courage to speak aloud. "Perhaps for years, though I did not recognize the emotion as love, but rather mistook it for appreciation of your competence, for gratitude that you managed my aunt so well and freed me from obligations I found burdensome, for the vague comfort I felt whenever you were near, even though I could not have articulated what created that sense of rightness and peace in your presence. I thought I was incapable of love after Clarissa, thought she had destroyed something essential in me that could never be repaired, and so I did not look for love, or expect it, or allow myself to feel anything beyond the carefully controlled politeness I employed to keep everyone at a safe distance." Grace turned to look at him finally, unable to maintain her forward focus when he was speaking such extraordinary words, when he was describing feelings she had never dared hope he might experience, and she saw in his face such naked vulnerability, such obvious fear mixed with desperate hope, that her breath caught in her throat and her vision blurred with tears she could not prevent from falling. "You cannot mean this," she whispered, her voice breaking on words. "You cannot tell me you love me after 8 years of barely noticing my existence, after treating me with the same remote courtesy you employ toward everyone, after making it abundantly clear through word and deed that you preferred isolation to any genuine human connection. I have loved you for 8 years, 4 months, and 11 days, Mark. I have counted every single day of my devotion and my suffering, have performed countless acts of care that you never noticed or acknowledged, have existed in a state of perpetual invisibility while hoping desperately that somehow you might see me as something more than your aunt's your companion. And now, when I have finally gathered the courage to leave, when I have made the impossible decision to walk away from you because staying was destroying me, you tell me you love me. How can I possibly believe that? How can I trust that this is genuine feeling rather than simply panic at losing someone whose usefulness you have finally recognized now that I am departing? Because I am terrified, Marcus said simply, his hands rising as if to touch her face but stopping just short of actual contact, hovering in the space between them with visible trembling that communicated his emotional state more clearly than any words could have done. "I am absolutely terrified of your rejection, of offering you my heart and having you refuse it because I have already caused you too much pain through my blindness and my cowardice, because you have made the healthy decision to leave and build a life elsewhere rather than continuing to suffer in proximity to someone who wounded you through sheer oblivious cruelty. I am terrified that I have realized the truth too late, that you cannot forgive the 8 years I wasted, being unable to see what was directly in front of me, that my love comes too late and too damaged to be worth accepting, even if you can bring yourself to believe in its sincerity." He drew a shuddering breath, his eyes never leaving hers, his expression raw with emotion so powerful that Grace could feel it like a physical force in the air between them. "But I am more terrified of not speaking at all," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "of allowing you to leave without telling you that you have been essential to my happiness for years, though I did not understand that truth until you announced your departure, that you have made my life bearable and occasionally even joyful through your quiet presence and your countless acts of care, that I have been falling in love with you so gradually and naturally that I mistook the emotion for simple contentment until the prospect of your absence made me understand how thoroughly you had become woven into the fabric of my daily existence. I love you, Grace Pemberton, and I am begging you not to leave, to give me the opportunity to court you properly, to demonstrate through actions rather than words that I can become worthy of the devotion you have already shown me, to prove that I am capable of being the partner you deserve, rather than the distant employer who has taken you for granted for far too long." Grace felt something break open in her chest, some barrier that had been holding back emotions too large and complex to contain, and she found herself reaching for him without conscious decision, her hands finding his face and pulling him down toward her until their lips met in a kiss that tasted of tears and relief and the desperate joy of finally being seen and chosen and loved by the man who had occupied her thoughts and her heart for 8 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Marcus's arms came around her with careful strength, holding her as if she were infinitely precious, as if he had been granted something miraculous that he feared might disappear if he did not maintain physical contact to prove her reality and her presence. When they finally separated, both breathing heavily and both clearly shaken by the intensity of emotion that simple kiss had released, Marcus rested his forehead against hers and spoke words that would remain imprinted on Grace's memory for all the years that followed. "I choose you," he said fiercely. "I choose you over isolation, over fear, over the comfortable distance I have maintained to protect myself from potential hurt. I choose you, Grace, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that I understand what a gift you are offering me through your forgiveness, through your willingness to give me a second chance. I have done nothing to earn, except finally find the courage to speak the truth. My heart has been trying to tell me for longer than I was willing to acknowledge." "I choose you as well," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to fall. Tears of joy rather than sorrow now. Tears of relief and gratitude, and the overwhelming recognition that the impossible had somehow become possible, that love she had thought hopelessly one-sided had been reciprocated all along, if only she had been able to see past Marcus's defensive walls to the genuine feeling beneath. I choose you despite the pain you have caused through your blindness, despite the years I spent loving you in silence while you remained unconscious of my devotion. I choose you because I have seen who you truly are beneath the armor you constructed after Clarissa's betrayal, because I have witnessed your kindness and your integrity and your capacity for deep feeling, even when you were trying so hard to feel nothing at all. I choose you, Marcus Ashford, and I will remain at Thornbridge, not as your aunt's companion, but as the woman who loves you and whom you have finally learned to love in return. They stood together in the portrait gallery, while afternoon light painted the marble floors in shades of amber and gold. Two people who had existed in the same house for 8 years, without truly seeing each other, until the prospect of separation had forced recognition and truth, and the courage required to speak feelings that had been present all along beneath the surface of their careful interactions. Lady Beatrice found them there an hour later, still standing close together and speaking in low voices about the future they would build together, about courtship and marriage and all the ordinary days and extraordinary moments that comprised a life well lived, and she had smiled with such satisfaction that both Marcus and Grace had laughed despite themselves at her obvious pleasure in the outcome of her forceful intervention. "I told you that you were a fool if you let her leave," Lady Beatrice said, addressing her nephew with the fond exasperation of someone who loved him despite his many failings. "I am pleased to see that for once you actually listened to my advice, rather than stubbornly insisting on maintaining your isolation at all costs. Now, I expect you will be wanting to court Grace properly before making any formal announcements, and I suggest you begin by taking her for a walk in that rose garden you have been haunting every evening for the past 2 weeks. And perhaps this time you might actually speak to her about something of substance rather than making inane comments about the weather as if you were strangers making polite conversation at a tedious dinner party." Marcus had flushed slightly at his aunt's accurate assessment of his awkward attempts at proximity, but he had simply offered Grace his arm with a smile that transformed his face from severe to genuinely warm, the first completely unguarded expression she had seen from him in 8 years, 4 months, and 11 days of careful observation. "Would you do me the honour of walking with me, Miss Pemberton?" he asked, with exaggerated formality that made Grace laugh despite the emotional chaos of the past hour, despite the tears that still occasionally escaped and tracked down her cheeks. "I find I have a great deal to say to you about roses and poetry, and all the ways I plan to demonstrate my devotion now that I am finally brave enough to acknowledge its existence." "I would be delighted, Lord Ashford," Grace replied, matching his tone, while her eyes communicated far more than her words, while her hand on his arm trembled slightly, with the overwhelm of everything that had happened and everything that still lay ahead. "Though I should warn you that I have rather high expectations after 8 years of waiting, and you will need to be very persuasive indeed if you hope to convince me that your love is worth the suffering your blindness caused during all those years of invisibility." "I will spend the rest of my life being persuasive," Marcus promised, leading her toward the door and the gardens beyond, toward the future they would build together from the ruins of wasted time and the foundation of genuine feeling that had existed all along beneath their careful performances of employer and employee, lord and companion, two people existing in proximity, without recognition, until crisis and departure had forced truth into the light where it could finally be acknowledged and acted upon. And if that proves insufficient, then I will spend the next life and all the lives after that continuing to demonstrate that some transformations, however belated, are genuine and lasting and worth the courage required to finally speak the truth that fear has kept silent for far too long. They walked together into the rose garden, while the sun set behind Thornbridge Hall, and Lady Beatrice watched from her window with satisfaction and affection, seeing in their joined hands and their close proximity the promise of happiness finally claimed after years of unnecessary suffering, of love finally acknowledged after too long spent hiding behind walls that had never been as necessary or as protective as fear had insisted. And Grace Pemberton, who had loved Marcus Ashford for 8 years, 4 months, and 11 days without hope of return, who had decided to leave because staying had become unbearable, who had chosen self-preservation over proximity and her own future over the torture of continued invisibility, felt peace settle over her like a benediction, The recognition that her love had not been wasted, but simply waiting. That Marcus's transformation was genuine and his devotion real. And that sometimes the courage to leave created the crisis necessary for the truth to finally emerge into the light, where it could flourish, rather than remaining buried beneath fear and self-protection, and the comfortable lies people told themselves to avoid the vulnerability that genuine connection required. Good night.